Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our 2019 annual dinner. I'm Catherine Rafelson, President of SID-Washington, and thank you. We're so pleased to see so many people here tonight. Many familiar faces and also many new ones. To those whom we know, it's great to see you. And to those who are new to SID-Washington and to our annual dinner, welcome. Tonight we are honoring Paul Polman, former CEO of Unilever and co-founder and chair of a new international development organization called Imagine. Paul has been called a hero of conscious capitalism, the epitome of a 21st century CEO, and a crucial voice for corporate responsibility. You'll hear more about Paul later, but I just want to say how pleased we are to have him here tonight. Paul flew in from Europe this afternoon to be here, and he's flying back out again tonight. So to get him on his flight, we're going to move things around a little bit. We're going to start our award presentation a little earlier, and we're going to end slightly earlier too. But the good news is that this means we're going to have a little more time for networking at the end of our evening over coffee and dessert, so I hope that you'll all plan to stay for that. Before our formal program begins, I'm going to let you resume your conversations and eat your dinner, but first I want to thank those who make this event possible, our sponsors. There are 43 organizations in this room who provided generous support to allow us to hold this event, and we are grateful to each of you. But I want to give a special thanks to Creative Associates, who sponsored that terrific reception. And I want to thank our diamond sponsor, Chemonics, and show you a very short video that Chemonics made for us.
Hi.
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 Hola.
I work in development because I want to make a difference in my community.
Chemonics is a company that is full of people who are passionate about the work that they do, who are passionate about the people that they work with, and passionate about the countries that they work in.
Working in an environment where you can bring about meaningful change to help people, impact people's lives that you might even never get to meet in your lifetime, but bringing about that change, evolving, changing societies, making things better, it gives you that sense of fulfillment when working here in Chemonics.
I work here.
I work here.
I work here because development works here.
Because development works here.
Because development works here.
Thank you, Chemonics, and thank you again to all of our sponsors. Now please enjoy your meal, and I'll be back up here in about a half hour to start our formal program. I hate to interrupt all the great conversation. I hope you're all having as interesting conversation as I was having at my table just now about nail polish with Paul Foldy. But as I mentioned before, our honoree has a flight to catch, so we're going to start a little earlier. Please continue to eat, and we'll carry on. When the Society for International Development was founded in 1957, the field was largely the realm of NGOs. Today, there are numerous sectors involved in development work, and all of them are represented in this room here tonight. As the field has evolved, it has been increasingly crucial to partner across sectors to accomplish the important work you and your organizations do every day. To that end, we at SID-Washington hold events like this one to bring all the sectors together and facilitate partnerships. I hope that many of you met a new potential partner at our reception earlier this evening or at your dinner table. And if you did not, you'll still have that opportunity later this evening when we have more networking over coffee and dessert, so I do hope you'll stay for that. In addition to bringing sectors together, we also bring together individuals at all stages of their careers. When I thanked our sponsors earlier, I neglected to mention a very special sponsorship we have, which allows students to attend this dinner. We have a number of students in the room thanks to the very generous support of FHI 360 and RTI, so I just want to thank you. And I hope you'll all find our students and talk to them tonight. And as always, we also have many young professionals with us tonight. And I hope all the students and the young professionals plan to go to our Young Professionals After Party sponsored by Making Sense later this evening. And it's not limited to young people. As I say every year, the term young professionals in this context is self-defining. And if you feel young enough to go out at 9:00 p.m., you are very welcome to attend. And Paul, I'm so sorry that you're going to miss that party. Speaking of young people, since I have had a tendency to overshare the trials and tribulations of raising teenagers, many of you know that I recently sent my oldest child to college. And the challenge is, that really deserves applause, those of you who know what I went through. And the challenges we faced getting to that point, and the challenge that's ongoing of keeping him there, make me think a lot about the journey to self-reliance. And speaking of the journey to self-reliance, Bonnie Glick is here tonight, Deputy Administrator of USAID. And I'm sure many of you have heard Bonnie talk about the journey to self-reliance and also about private sector engagement. Although one website I looked at indicates that the private sector was involved in development in ancient times, I really found a website that said that, I think most would agree it's a bit more recent. And the private sector's potential to help all of us achieve the Sustainable Development Goals has most certainly not been tapped. We had an event earlier this week in New York as part of an effort to expand the SID-Washington network beyond the DC area. So let me digress for just a minute and explain that we have a task force of our board, chaired by Sue Chodakowicz of Nathan, who's here tonight, looking at what we are calling SID Beyond the DMV. And for Paul Polman and others not from this area, DMV stands for DC, Maryland, and Virginia. Because we now have so many members around the country that we are exploring how best to serve them and how to broaden our network to include more people and organizations throughout the US. Some of you may not realize this, but we now have institutional members based in Arizona, California, Colorado, Connecticut, Georgia, Idaho, Illinois, Indiana, Massachusetts, Michigan, Minnesota, New Jersey, New Mexico, North Carolina, Oregon, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, Utah, Vermont, and Wisconsin. And those are just the US-based members. We also have members based in the Netherlands, the country of Georgia, Denmark, and Germany. And some, of course, have large DC presences, but some do not. And our individual members are even more dispersed. So we are beginning to hold events outside of DC. And at this event in New York earlier this week, which was focused on the BUILD Act and the new Development Finance Corporation, several times our speakers emphasized the importance of the private sector in development. And I know this is not news to anyone in this room, but it is striking to me how much more often when we are discussing private sector, how much more often we are discussing private sector engagement at our events, how it creeps into almost every conversation, and how the possibilities and potential are not just exciting, but crucial. It will allow us to have greater impact and scale solutions. It will move us forward more quickly and efficiently on the journey to self-reliance, and it will drive transformative change. So as we expand both geographically and sectorally, SID-Washington recognizes the importance of the private sector to our network, which has grown far beyond the group of individuals and NGOs that first gathered more than 60 years in DC. Last year, we paid tribute to the late Kofi Annan and talked about his encouragement of private sector participation in development when he headed the UN. Tonight, we honor another giant of private sector engagement in development. And to tell you more, I'd like to introduce Melissa Logan, Chair of the SID-Washington Board and Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer of Chemonics, to introduce our honoree.
All right, so I can tell by the volume of noise that everybody's having a good time networking, which I'm thrilled about because that's why we come together. But for the next 30 minutes or so, I'd like to ask for your attention because we have an extraordinary program planned for you this evening. As Catherine mentioned, I'm the chair of the Board of Directors for the Society for International Development. And before I introduce our honoree this evening, on behalf of the entire SID-Washington community, I'd like to extend my gratitude to all of our sponsors and attendees for your incredible support of SID-Washington. Over the past 3 years, as Catherine mentioned, we've made a deliberate and a meaningful effort to expand our membership to include new and different voices. And I'm really delighted to see so many new faces here this evening. As we come to the close of 2019, and indeed to the close of the decade, the SID-Washington community is more vibrant and engaged than ever. We have nearly 200 institutional members and more than 15,000 professionals, practitioners, and policymakers who are engaging every day through dynamic programming and events and social media. And equally important, as Catherine mentioned, we have also diversified our membership base to include more organizations and more companies from the technology, investment, and corporate sectors, because we recognize the only way to achieve transformational changes set forth in the Sustainable Development Goals is through partnership and through collective action. Given our focus, and I would also say it's our imperative, to be more inclusive and more ambitious in driving sustainable solutions to irreversibly eradicate poverty, we could not think of a more extraordinary honoree for this year's dinner than Paul Polman. While I recognize that most of you are in the room are familiar with Paul's background, I will only summarize it here. Paul began his career at Procter & Gamble in 1979 as a cost analyst and grew within the organization, excelling as a manager and leader until he was tapped to serve as president for the Europe division in 2001. After 27 years at Procter & Gamble, Paul joined Nestle as the Chief Financial Officer and Head of the Americas. And in 2009, Paul became the Chief Executive Officer of Unilever, where he oversaw an extraordinary agenda for sustainable living plans that he intends to amplify in his current role as co-founder and chair of Imagine, a benefit corporation and foundation accelerating business leadership to achieve the global goals for sustainable development. With such a long career in the corporate sector, those that do not know Paul may be wondering why we are honoring him tonight at the Society of International Development with our Leadership and Development Award. Well, I'm excited to share with you exactly why we've asked him to join us tonight. And I'm going to ask now for everyone to stop talking, because you don't want to miss what I'm going to say. All right? Listen to what I have to say about our honoree. Throughout Paul's career, he's always believed that you could do good and you could do well. And as CEO of Unilever, he put those words into action. In under less than a decade, Paul aligned more than 170,000 global Unilever staff around the principle that business should serve society first, not shareholders, and that both could prosper under a model of long-term responsible and sustainable business practices. In 2010, he launched Unilever's Sustainable Living Plans with 3 ambitious goals. 1, to improve the health and well-being for more than 1 billion people. 2, to reduce the environmental impact of the business and its products by half. And 3, to enhance the livelihood of millions. And in less than 10 years, Unilever's impact on improving the planet and human development, especially those at the bottom of the pyramid, has been astounding. More than 1 billion, in fact 1.24 billion people as of 2018 have been reached with hand washing education, safer drinking water, and improved access to sanitation. CO2 emissions have been reduced by 52%. Water use in production decreased by 44%. Waste from production decreased by 97%. More than 50% of agricultural raw materials are sustainably sourced. Nearly 2 million women have reached access to initiatives to promote their safety, develop their skills, and expand their opportunities. And nearly 1 million smallholder farmers have accessed initiatives to improve their agricultural practices and increase their incomes. And all of this was realized while Unilever also achieved 8 years of top-line growth, averaging twice the overall market growth and delivering a total shareholder return of nearly 300%. Doing well and doing good are not mutually exclusive. And while you may assume he declared success with those results, he did not. Like the SID community, he understood that truly transformational change requires speed and scale, so he strove to do more. Paul reached out to form partnerships and coalitions across the corporate, philanthropic, donor, humanitarian, and development sectors to inspire and influence others to advance the well-being of people and our planet. He started and now leads the sustainability efforts for the Consumer Goods Forum and serves as a member of the board of the UN Global Compact. And he was one of the 27 members of that were tapped to form the high-level panel to develop the SDGs that we all work towards every single day. The list of appointments and awards he holds is longer than the guest list tonight, which is over 700 people. But they all have a common thread: raising awareness among the private sector that businesses can embrace sustainable development and still return profits to their investors. Doing well and doing good are not mutually exclusive. Last but not least, I'd be remiss if I did not mention Paul's commitment to nurturing the next generation of leaders, which is a core tenet of the SID-Washington mission, as Catherine mentioned. He chairs the Global Advisory Board of One Young World, an organization which identifies, promotes, and connects the world's most impactful young leaders to create a better world with more responsible and more effective leadership. Prior to this role, for years, he served as a counselor supporting and mentoring emerging leaders at youth summits. And he actively engages with young professionals in the division of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. At the recent release of the Youth Solutions Report, focusing on innovative approaches to lifting vulnerable communities out of poverty, Paul noted, quote, with 25% of the global population between 10 and 24 years old, it's time we not only get the youth at the table, but frankly, we give them the table. I would be honored and am extraordinarily humbled to continue to share Paul's remarkable accomplishments with you, but I am sure he has a lot better things to say than I do. So in closing, I'm going to ask you to please join in congratulating this true sustainable development pioneer on his award for leadership and development.
Okay. Well, first of all, good evening, everybody. And thank you to Melissa and Catherine for these kind words. I'm always happy that my mother isn't here. I was in the COP25. I just came back from Madrid. The reason that I'm here going back and forth was it was originally planned in Chile, and this was a very convenient way to fly back to the UK and fly over Washington. But as the COP got moved from Chile to Madrid, I ended up flying back and forth from Madrid and to be with you. But I wanted to do this not only because I'd made the commitment, but more importantly, just to say thank you. Thank you for all what you are doing to make this a better world for all. It's really appreciated. It's no doubt that Washington is a wonderful city and has also become one of the exciting capitals of the world. And tonight we have added London to that. Unfortunately, may I say. It's actually so cold outside that I even saw a politician coming in here from the airport who had his hands in his own pocket. So, anyway, to be serious, I really appreciate this prestigious award, and also knowing the people that came before me who I hold in high esteem, like Kofi Annan or Henrietta Fore, people that do wonderful things for this world. And a wonderful occasion when you get this award to dedicate it still to the too many people who are left behind. And this is what I want to talk about. The populism, nationalism, reactionary policies that we see everywhere, the lack of what seems increasingly the lack of international cooperation requires more than ever that others rally to the task. You are here with a community of NGOs or civil society, universities, the private sector, the subnational level to fill that vacuum, and boy is that needed. When I came at the airport in London this morning to take my flight, I overheard 3 people talk, and soon I discovered that one was a doctor, one was an engineer, and the other one was an economist. There were 3 guys, and as you can imagine, with 3 guys sitting there, they were bragging. Now, normally, you don't listen into what people talk about, but I know you do it, so I am not ashamed to tell you what I heard. So the doctor said, I have the oldest profession in the world, because you go back to the book of Genesis, and out of the ribs of Adam came Eve, and both patients survived, so first successful operation. We have the oldest profession in the world. The engineer said, that's not true, we have the oldest profession. There was chaos, we created the universe, organized, everything turns around anything. If anybody can make from chaos an organized structure, that's an engineer. So we have the oldest profession in the world. And the economist said, I don't think so. I think we do, because who created chaos in the first place? And I think that is exactly what we are dealing with nowadays. In 1859, Dickens wrote a book, The Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. He talked about a spring of hope and a winter of despair. And I think that is a good analogy of where we are right now. Never ever have we lifted so many people out of poverty over the last few decades. In fact, the original Millennial Development Goal, which had a simple goal to halve the number of people living in poverty, which was at that time in the year 2000 defined as $1.25 a day, lo and behold, we actually achieved that. We achieved it even earlier than the 15-year time span. It is a good time to be born. People have longer, healthier lives. More people are in education. Every day, 235,000 people get access to clean drinking water and sanitation. Every day in this world, over 200,000 people are lifted out of poverty. It is a good time to be born. But at the same time, we're also seeing that there are some downsides of our current economic system that are becoming increasingly more transparent. Especially in the crisis, I would go back to 2007, 2008. Before that, the stock market was going up every year, 7, 8, 9%. People were not really asking the questions. But when we got the crash, there was a little bit of a moment of reflection. And we could see that a system of economic growth that is based on high levels of government debt or private debt, overconsumption by, may I argue, a small part of the population, putting these pressures on the planetary boundaries, and frankly leaving too many people behind, is not a sustainable system. Any system where too many people don't feel they're participating fully or are left behind will ultimately rebel against itself. And I think increasingly we're seeing the signs of that. As I stand here and talk, in about 20 countries in the world, in all of the continents of this world, we have people in the streets making their voices heard. And you'll have to go back a long time in the history of mankind to find equal activity like this. The two most pressing issues that I want to focus on tonight, that I also think are the most pressing issues that hopefully you will deal with, is actually climate change and income inequality. And not surprisingly, these issues are both sides of the same coin. As I said, I just came from the COP in Madrid, the COP25, an absolutely important COP going into the COP26 next year in Glasgow, because we're 5 years in the Paris Agreement and the countries are supposed to come back right now with higher ambitions. Instead, we're still on a trajectory globally that is at 3.2 degrees, unaffordable, as we can only afford really a 1.5 degrees Celsius. And I apologize, at Celsius, you have to convert it yourself in Fahrenheit. The IPCC report was very clear. And I think we created an increased awareness in the world, brought people in the streets, and moved many in any sector that we're in, including the private sector, to higher levels of action. In fact, in the US, you had also your own national climate assessment report, where 13 federal agencies pointed out the devastating consequences of climate change if not aggressively tackled. Political unrest and insecurity being one of them, but also the effects of natural disasters. And you've had plenty of those. This year alone, we're spending combined about $1 trillion in natural disasters. Many in this country. Parts of this country burning whilst others are flooding or suffering from hurricanes. Soon, many of the houses in some of the parts of your country will be uninsurable. In fact, some of that has started already. In fact, the cost of climate change that we're currently incurring is about $5.3 trillion. Next to climate change, we're playing with the resources, the limited resources that we have in this world. This year, World Overshoot Day, as it is called, the day that we have used up all the resources our ecosystems can support, was July 29th, which means that we're actually running at 1.75% the capacity of what this planet Earth can support. And also there, we're seeing the effects of this. Soon we have more plastic in the oceans than fish. 1 million species are at risk of being extinct. We've probably done more damage to this planet Earth in the last 20, 30 years than in its whole 5 billion years of existence. The simple question is, what gives us the right to do this? Hubert Reeves, who lives not far from here on the other side of the border in Canada, said it very well when he said that man is the most insane species. He worships an invisible God and destroys a visible nature, not realizing that the visible nature he destroys is the invisible God he worships in the first place. The Secretary General this morning, when we had our meeting, made it very clear that according to the broad consensus of science and most people in this world, we're about 5 minutes before midnight. Fortunately, in the US, with campaigns like the America Pledge or We're Still In, we're seeing 70% of the American GDP putting active climate action in place. 4,800 organizations at subnational level, many of them companies, but also regions and states and cities that are putting themselves actively behind the Paris Agreement. They want to be part of the future. They want to ensure that their companies stay valid, and yes, they also know that it makes a lot of economic sense. So whilst at the federal level you might be heading towards going out of Paris, I would argue that this country is very much in Paris, and I want to thank you for that. We've also been very impressed by a coalition we've put together just in 2 weeks' time for the run-up to the COP25 of about 80 of the leading CEOs in this country, from the biggest companies that you have, from Microsoft to Salesforce, or to the Nestle's, or to the Pepsi's, the Cokes, and many others, where the CEOs have been courageous to sign a declaration together with the AFL-CIO. For the first time, I might argue, in the history, in a country where that is not as obvious as the part of the world that I came from, not only pledging to stay in the Paris Agreement and accelerate their actions, but also looking at the social consequences of this transition and looking at just transition, as we call it, and the livelihoods as you move this economy from what some might call from gray to green. And the signs of that conversion are there. The Saudi Aramco flotation, many people broadly call that a moderate success at best. The big concessions in front of the coast of Brazil for oil drilling, nobody bid on it. Your biggest coal company in this country going bankrupt. In fact, more coal companies are closing despite active efforts to prevent that than in any time in history. Why? Because it just doesn't make economic sense. However, we have to take care of the coal miners. They've given us the energy, the lives, the prosperity that we benefit from. Just transition and looking at the livelihoods is a very important part. And I'm proud of these American CEOs who have taken the courage in what I realize is a tough environment to actually put their voices together and their companies behind it. The second issue that we need to address urgently is an equally important global issue, the one of income inequality. Last year, for the first time in the history of mankind, the bottom 3.8 billion people in the world saw their combined net wealth go down by 11%. We've never seen that. We've never seen that. And just the billionaires alone saw their wealth increase by another 12%, which is about $900 billion. Just taking 0.5% of the wealth of the top 1% in this world, many located in this part of the world or where I come from, would put the 246 million children in school that are currently excluded, would provide health care and life-saving access to about 3.5 million people, children, may I say, that otherwise don't make it past the age of 5. Many have discovered in the financial crisis of 2007, 2008, that the banks might have been too big to fail, but frankly, people were too small to matter. And again, I think the reactions you're starting to see. Now, we have a plan. The issues might be overwhelming, and we certainly are not rising to the challenge to deal with it, including the private sector, may I ask. We're at a point that we need to decarbonize our global economies. There is no alternative. But yet we are carbon junkies and don't know how to grow our economies without the fossil fuel. We need to move to a more circular, or I would argue regenerative economy if we want to use the scarce resources that we have and pass some on at least to our future generations to also benefit from this planet. We need to move the financial markets to the longer term, which with the enormous amounts of money we've pushed into these global economies seem to get shorter and shorter in their pursuit of short-term profits. And then, you would agree with me, we need to create an economic system that is more inclusive. Now, normally, we would depend on governments to guide the way, but the reality is that the global governance that we've designed basically dates back from 1944 at the time of Bretton Woods. Any company in this room would have had 15, 20 or more different strategies to still be here and stay alive. Our global governance is terribly outdated at a time that we have more issues like climate change, cybersecurity, financial market coordination that needs to happen. So we can sit here and be cynical about politicians or skeptical about their efforts of what they're doing or if they produce results, but frankly that doesn't lead to anything. I have to argue also here in Washington that it takes courage to be a politician these days. It does take courage. And just instead of blaming them, we just cannot afford that, especially as we see the world under us wither away and more people potentially driving themselves back into poverty. Just climate change alone is putting 100 million more people in poverty. And by the way, it's everywhere. Don't deny it in this country either. You have 80 million people, about $500 away from the poverty line. The average retirement of hardworking Americans is $7,000. Just your car breaking down or a health casualty in the family could push you off the line. And many are visible. Just visit with me the Seattles or the Los Angeles or the San Franciscos. That's not how you've designed the American dream. That's not how it should be in any country in the world. And you know it as well as anybody else. So we have a challenge here. We have a challenge here. As the politicians fail to address it at the speed and scale that is needed, we have to step up and rise to the challenge. The combined money that is being spent by governments on overseas development aid is about $150 billion. The $150 billion will not be enough to address all these issues. We have a great plan that guides us, which is called the Sustainable Development Goals. 193 countries signing in September 2015 at the UN. A plan or a promise to irreversibly eradicate poverty and to doing that in a more sustainable and equitable way. What's wrong with that? We went halfway with the Millennial Development Goals. Why can't we finish the job in the next 15 years? When you went to the moon with the Apollo, you didn't stop halfway. Oh, I didn't like the food, I go home, my wife cooks better. When Eugene Bolt ran the 100 meters, he didn't stop at 50. I'm tired, I'll do the other 50 later. We finished the job. It's a plan that puts people at the center, not leaving anybody behind. It's a plan for people, a plan for peace, prosperity, a plan for the planet, and above all, a plan for partnership. The issues that we have to address here are simply too difficult for each and any of us individually to achieve that. Nor can we expect to solve these issues at the levels that we're currently operating. Goal 17 is a goal of partnership. I'll talk about it in a second, but that's more important than ever. Now, the implementation of these Sustainable Development Goals has a funding gap of about $1 to $3 trillion a year. $1 to $3 trillion might sound like a lot to you, but it's only about 1 to 3% of the global economy. And frankly, half of our money supply is now earning 0 or negative interest rates. And yet, we're sitting on probably one of the biggest investment opportunities that we have in human history, if we would just see it. One of my other activities is working on a foundation for blind children in Africa. And you have in this country a wonderful school for the blind in Boston, Massachusetts, Perkins, where Helen Keller went. She was blind and deaf. She spoke 7 languages and was an amazing woman. And she was often asked, it must be terrible to be blind and deaf. And her answer was always the same. The worst thing is not being blind. The worst thing is having eyes and not being able to see. And we currently live in a world where too many people have eyes but are not able to see. Where some people believe that greed is good, but I can tell you generosity will always win. And the essence of the Sustainable Development Goal gets to a form of partnership that calls first and foremost for putting the interest of others ahead of your own, knowing that by doing so, you'll be better off yourselves as well. I would argue that our inability to act at the speed and scale that we need is resulting in the fact that each and every of these 17 Sustainable Development Goals is currently incurring costs that are higher than what it would cost us to implement all of the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, you might be surprised, but climate change is costing the world about $5.3 trillion a year right now, nearly twice as much as the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. Delhi had to shut down the other day. 8 million people dying prematurely of air pollution. One of your biggest healthcare costs in this country with children is actually related to air pollution. The fact that in most of the countries of this world, women don't have the same rights as men. Goal number 5, gender equality. Just giving women the same access to education, financing, land rights would unlock the global economy by about $26 trillion. The food supply, the way we produce food in this world, goal number 2, food security. You'd think we're idiots if you come from Mars. The only way we produce food is by cutting down the forests of this world at a rate that we've never seen before. Every year, the size of a country like the UK is disappearing. The Amazon, deforestation under Bolsonaro's government, up 95%. The laws haven't changed, but the enforcement sure has. Then we have a great sports in keeping the 900 million people poor that are basically monocrop farmers. That's also where you find the 160 million children that are born stunted every year. And then we have the audacity to waste about 30–40% of the food as if we don't care anyway. If the waste of food was a country, it would be the 3rd biggest emitter of carbon after China and the US. And then on the other side, we're creating the biggest epidemic of diabetes too we've ever seen in the history of mankind. Getting now over 2 billion people overweight or obese. So that's our food system. You know, it just takes about 10% of the food waste to ensure that the 800 million people that go to bed every day hungry, not even knowing if they wake up the next day, it just takes that amount, that little amount, to solve it. Just in food security, we calculated, making our food and land use systems work, we could unlock the global economy from a negative cost of 12 trillion right now to all these externalities to a positive of 4 trillion. And my last example, not to bother you too much, is goal number 16 of peace and justice. It talks about rule of law, access to legal systems. This world, by not addressing the issues that it needs to address, is spending $8 to 12% of its GDP on conflict prevention and wars. That's 3 to 4 times more than the implementation of all the Sustainable Development Goals. I rest my case, but we certainly cannot yet qualify in calling ourselves the most intelligent species. So we need to work differently, and we need to attack the issues collectively differently under the banner or framework of these Sustainable Development Goals. The interesting thing is, we are so forewarned about what is going to happen, but we are also so forearmed with tools to do something about it. We frankly don't need any more PhDs or having the billionaires invent new space missions to Mars or Pluto to look for the answer. We have it all here. We know how to produce food without cutting the forest. We know how to build houses without having the homeless. And frankly, we also know how to provide green energy now without cutting off people from that basic necessity. The missing thing at the end of the day is human willpower, itself a renewable resource. The bigger question that we need to face ourselves collectively and individually is really, do we care? Do we really care? And the answer right now is not quite. We're undermining some of the basic principles on which this society is based. Dignity and respect for everybody. It's the minimum that we could wish. People have at least a chance to have a roof above their heads, or food in their bellies when they want to go to bed, or a chance to education, or perhaps a simple piece of bar soap to wash their hands so they can make it past the age of 5, or clean drinking water, or a toilet perhaps. We know how to build these things. Equity, equal opportunities should be our second value. At least provide for everybody the same opportunities. We're darn lucky to be here. We're darn lucky where we were born. It wasn't our choice. We won the lottery ticket of life. Didn't do anything for it. We're financially independent, can work and live where we want, never had to worry about having food or sanitation. In fact, many of us don't even know what it means to be deprived of it. Well, the sad part is, if that is the case, you now probably belong only to about 2% of the world population. And if you only belong to about 2% of the world population, then it is our duty to put ourselves to the service of the other 98%. And striving for equity, equal opportunities for all, must be something we need to do. If we don't do that, we undermine the basic essence of humanity itself. That means equal rights for women, that means LGBT communities, that means the minorities, but it also means the disadvantaged countries that might not be here, or perhaps in this country as well, that you don't want to recognize. And the final value that we need to drive, in my opinion, is a little bit of compassion. We've boiled down our economies to some simple numbers and are chasing the wrong objectives. Produce more stuff, discharge your externalities. Short-term profit seems to be the measure of success. You can get applause with a 300% shareholder return, or making another billion. But isn't it about the billions of people that we want to reach? Shouldn't we applaud the people that are the true billionaires? Not the ones that have all the money, but the ones that improve the lives of the billions of people, that understand that if we don't do that, we're all in danger. We cannot continue to live on these islands of prosperity in an increasingly larger sea of poverty. It just doesn't work. So we need to move our businesses from simply running it for value to businesses that are based on values to create the value. I was very pleased to see your BRT statement that at least put the shareholders at par with the other stakeholders. But shouldn't it be that we should entirely focus first and foremost on the other stakeholders? Aren't we there as businesses to ensure first and foremost that we make a positive contribution to society? If not, why should we be allowed to be around in the first place? Society won't let businesses around for too long anymore if you have a negative footprint. In fact, that is already happening as we're standing here. When I was born, the average lifetime of a publicly traded company in this great country was 67 years. It has gone down to 17 years now. It's very difficult to run a company. But if you run it for the shareholders only, it's even more difficult. The graveyard is full of companies that say, thank you, I ran it for the shareholders. Business needs to run it for its multiple stakeholders, and by doing well, ultimately the shareholders will benefit. Fortunately, you have some great leaders that understand this, but we need to create more of them. Leaders, indeed, that put the interest of others ahead of their own. Leaders that can think intergenerational. Leaders that operate with a higher sense of purpose. The Dalai Lama said it very well when he said that if you seek enlightenment just for yourself, to enhance yourself and your position, you miss purpose. But if you seek enlightenment for yourself to enable you to serve others, you are with purpose. My simple message to you today is not only to thank you once more for the wonderful work you do, but first and foremost, to live a life with purpose. Thank you very much.
All right, so Catherine is going to take Paul out to catch his car. When I asked him, why did you keep your commitment to us tonight when you flew all the way from Europe here, landed this afternoon and is flying back tonight? And he said, I made a promise to you and I'm going to keep my promise. I think the words that he spoke to us tonight were pretty true to what he said to me earlier this evening. Anyway, as Catherine said, we would like to invite all of you to continue to socialize, to network. We want to thank you again for coming out this evening, and for all of you who are young at heart or young at age, we remind you about our after party that's going to be held at Proper 21. Starting at 9 o'clock, and it's at 1319 F Street, just a couple of blocks away. It's being sponsored this year by Making Sense. So once again, thank you everyone for coming out. Happy holidays, and we look forward to seeing you in the next decade.